What's up, night owls? Welcome back to Demon Sleep. Real quick, drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from tonight. I personally read every single one of them, and honestly, it makes my day seeing you all from around the world. If these dark tailies help you drift off or just escape reality for a bit, smash that like button and subscribe. But only if you think we've earned it. No pressure. Alright, lights off, rain on, blankets up. Let's dive into tonight's nightmare fuel. Story 1, Frozen in the Dark. The first time he noticed it was during a graveyard shift, the kind where the clock barely moves and your thoughts start echoing too loudly. It was 11:40 p.m. on a Tuesday when Dwayne glanced through the back door and saw a refrigerated truck idling behind the dumpsters. No headlights, no markings, just the low, mechanical growl of its engine cutting through the quiet. What unsettled him wasn't the truck itself, it was the man inside. The driver sat perfectly still in the dark cab, hands on the wheel, posture stiff, like someone bracing for a moment he couldn't avoid. Not impatient, not distracted, waiting, and somehow aware. Dwayne had been on his feet for hours, restocking aisles that never changed, scrubbing floors already clean, flattening boxes until his fingers tingled with cold. He knew the delivery schedule by heart. Nothing ever arrived past 9. The paper was taped inside the manager's office, yellowed at the edges. This store didn't get surprises. It was the only grocery store left in town. The other one shut down years ago, boarded up and forgotten. If you lived in Cashington, you shopped here. Dwayne had grown up 2 streets away, learned how to be invisible in these aisles, bought his first illegal beer across the parking lot. Everyone knew everyone. In a town like this, nothing slipped through unnoticed. And yet here was this truck, plain white, no logo, no numbers. Just the refrigeration unit mounted on top, wheezing in slow, uneven intervals, on, off, on, like something breathing while it slept. Dwayne finished his cigarette and told himself it was nothing. Then he went back inside. But the image followed him. The way strange things do when you're exhausted enough that your mind doesn't argue, just accepts and stores them somewhere uncomfortable, like a stone under the skin. 2 nights later, it was back. Same time, same shadowed corner behind the dumpsters where the security lights failed to reach. This time, the driver's window was open. In the darkness, Dwayne saw the faint glow of a cigarette drifting up and down. He thought about walking closer, about clearing his throat, about saying something ordinary. But the stillness inside that cab felt heavy, almost deliberate, and he stayed where he was. That's when he started writing it down. In the small notebook he used for inventory counts, he marked the days. Tuesday there, Wednesday there, Thursday gone. The pattern repeated, weeks passed. Sometimes it came Monday nights, always midweek. Never when the manager stayed late to check actual shipments. The driver never stepped out, never touched the loading dock, just waited, engine running, refrigeration unit cycling with that same slow, patient rhythm. Once Dwayne saw another vehicle pull in. An old pickup, primer gray. 2 men climbed out without speaking, walked straight to the back of the truck and swung the doors open. The interior light flicked on, revealing stacked pallets arranged too neatly to be random. The men unloaded something from the pickup bed, something heavy enough to change the way they moved, then closed the doors. 4 minutes, no words, no hesitation. The truck pulled away first, the pickup followed. By the time the sound faded, the store behind Dwayne felt different, quieter, as if it had been holding its breath and finally let it out. No one ever said anything out loud. Dwayne thought about asking Dale, but he already knew how that would go. Dale had a look he used when questions crossed a line, a flat, patient stare that quietly reminded you of your place. Dale had been running this store for 23 years. Dwayne had been here 6 months and still felt like a guest who might be asked to leave at any moment. The invitation came on a Wednesday in early December. Dale cornered him in the break room, voice low, casual in a way that wasn't casual at all. He told Dwayne to stay after his shift. Unloading work, private contract, time and a half once the clock passed midnight. The way Dale phrased it made one thing clear: curiosity would not be rewarded. Dwayne's shift ended at 12. He could have clocked out, crossed the parking lot, climbed into his battered '91 Buick, the heater dead, the odometer long past caring, and driven back to the apartment he shared with his brother Kyle. Kyle hadn't worked since the Toyota plant cut its second shift. Money was thin. Heat was thinner. Instead, Dale was waiting by the loading dock. When he spotted Dwayne, he lifted one hand. Not a wave, not a greeting, a signal. The refrigerated truck was already backed in. Same truck, same silent presence, but this time the rear doors stood open. Wooden pallets lined the interior walls. Everything stacked between them was wrapped in thick, opaque plastic cinched tight. Dwayne caught the smell before he reached the dock. Not decay, not exactly. It was sharper than that. Like meat burned by cold, mixed with sweetness gone wrong. Ammonia and rot braided together. The kind of odor that crawled into your sinuses and refused to leave. Dale pressed a pair of heavy work gloves into his hands. 6 pallets, he said. Keep everything wrapped. Load it straight to the back freezer. That was it. The driver finally stepped down from the cab. He was younger than Dwayne expected, maybe 30. Narrow face, pale skin. His eyes drifted without settling, like they were always just missing whatever they were meant to look at. He didn't introduce himself, just moved to the back and started unhooking straps. Dwayne pulled on the gloves and climbed inside. The cold hit him like a wall. It wasn't gradual, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was absolute, so sharp it made his teeth throb. The silence inside the truck felt unnatural, thick and airless, as if sound itself had been frozen solid. When he stepped forward, the echo of his boots sounded wrong. Too loud, too alive. The first pallet weighed far more than it should have. As he dragged it toward the edge, something shifted beneath the plastic. There was a sound, soft, damp, unmistakably organic, like wet leather sliding against wet leather. No one spoke. They moved each pallet in turn. Dale guided them onto industrial dollies, steel frames with rubber wheels worn smooth from years of use. Dwayne pushed them down the corridor toward the damaged goods freezer, a walk-in unit abandoned when the store shut down its meat department 3 years earlier. The freezer was colder than the truck. Dwayne's breath didn't fog. It crystallized instantly, tiny shards of ice catching in his throat when he inhaled. Each exhale sounded brittle, fragile. The rubber wheels creaked as they rolled, the noise sharp in the frozen air, echoing off metal walls that hadn't heard footsteps in years. The rubber on the dolly wheels had stiffened in the cold. Each turn struck the frozen floor with a sharp clack, steady, methodical, like bones snapping one after another. Even through the thick gloves, the cold kept creeping deeper, slipping past skin and muscle until it settled into his joints. His hands didn't feel numb so much as unfamiliar, like they belonged to someone who had been still for a very long time. The first pallet slid into place without trouble. The second snagged on the threshold. Dwayne leaned into it, lifted hard, and the plastic shifted. For a moment, his lungs forgot how to work. A hand pressed against the wrapping from the inside, small, slender. The fingers curled slightly, frozen in a gesture that might once have meant rest or fear. The skin had that pale, waxy sheen, too smooth, too preserved. He set the pallet down too fast. Something slipped free from between the layers and hit the floor, bouncing once with a thin metallic chime before settling near his boot. A bracelet, silver dulled with age, tinged green where the metal had worn down. A charm hung from it, a tiny book, its edges rounded smooth by years of touch. Dwayne reacted without thinking. His foot came down, pinning it to the ice-slick floor. He glanced back over his shoulder. Dale hadn't moved. His expression was exactly the same as it had been all night. He lifted his chin a fraction, just enough to be understood. Keep going. When Dwayne returned for the third pallet, he crouched as if inspecting a stuck wheel. His fingers closed around the bracelet, and he shoved it deep into his pocket. The cold of it burned against his thigh, sharp and immediate, like a brand. Dale stood by the dock door, smoking. He spoke calmly, as if explaining store policy. Said that questions only made things harder. Said some problems couldn't survive regular systems. Hospitals, paperwork, coroners who asked too much and moved too slowly. Sometimes people just needed time. Time bought by cold. A place to hold something still until decisions could be made. The store got paid, they provided space, that was all. Dwayne asked quietly what was on the pallets. Dale studied him for a long moment. Then he dropped his cigarette and crushed it beneath his heel. He talked about a plastics plant over in Zanesville. A worker caught in an extruder. Messy. Final. The company didn't want inspectors crawling through the place. The family didn't want to wait weeks for an autopsy. Everyone wanted the same ending. Quick, silent, forgotten. That's one pallet, Dale said. You want the stories for the other 5. Dwayne shook his head. Dale nodded, satisfied. Told him to finish up, go home, and keep his mouth shut. There, be an extra $200 on his check this week. Just this once, so it looked clean. After that, cash. $200 every time. He asked if that was going to be an issue. $200 would keep the lights on. $200 meant Kyle wouldn't have to split pills in half and hope for the best. Dwayne thought about the frozen hand, the bracelet warming slowly in his pocket, the tiny book charm someone had chosen, worn, lived with. No problem, he said. They finished the job. 6 pallets lined the freezer wall, stacked where damaged turkeys used to sit, forgotten and frostbitten. When it was done, the driver climbed back into the cab without a word. The truck pulled away into the dark, leaving the store behind just as it always had been, quiet, ordinary, pretending nothing had ever happened. Dale didn't say another word. He stepped into the freezer doorway and pulled out a padlock Dwayne had never seen before. Thick, industrial, with a heavy combination dial instead of a key. He shut the door, spun the tumbler with practiced ease, and walked away without looking back. Disappearing into his office like this was just another task crossed off a list. Dwayne stayed where he was. The hallway lights buzzed overhead, flickering slightly. His hands had stopped trembling, but they didn't feel like his anymore. The smell still clung to him, that sharp, freezer-burned stench of old frost and preserved flesh. He breathed through his mouth, but it didn't help. The bracelet in his pocket was warm now. He wanted to pull it out, to look at it again, but the thought of Dale noticing, even hours later, made his chest tight. He clocked out, walked to his car, and drove home on autopilot. Kyle was asleep on the couch when he got there, the television muttering to itself in the dark. Dwayne sat alone in the kitchen and drank 3 beers back to back, fast enough that taste never registered. When he closed his eyes, the image was already waiting. The hand, small curled, frozen mid-gesture. He finally took the bracelet out and held it beneath the kitchen light. The silver was scratched and worn smooth. The book charm had tiny letters etched into it, careful and deliberate. On the back, a date. 16 years ago. Whoever wore this had been young when they first put it on. Young enough to choose something meaningful and carry it for years. He should have left it behind. But now it was here, warm from his skin, real in a way the freezer never was. He opened a drawer filled with batteries, spare keys, and matchbooks from restaurants that no longer existed. He dropped the bracelet inside and shut it, like that could erase it. The extra 200 showed up in his paycheck on Friday. After that, Dale switched to envelopes. No paperwork, no explanation, just cash passed hand to hand like a favor that never happened. The truck came back the following Tuesday. Same spot, same quiet, same driver sitting motionless in the dark. Dwayne didn't look for long. He finished his shift and went home. 11 days later, Dale found him restocking cereal. Another delivery, same deal. Dwayne said okay before the question was finished. This time there were only 4 pallets. The driver was different, older, with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow. He didn't make eye contact. The work moved faster. Dwayne knew the routine now. Which freezer door stuck, how to angle the dollies, how to breathe shallow when the smell hit. The silence inside didn't bother him anymore. When something shifted beneath the plastic, his hand stayed steady. A boot pressed against torn wrapping, a section of leg in work pants, something bundled inside a shower curtain printed with bright cartoon fish. Dale didn't explain. He watched, locked the freezer, and went back to his office. $200 appeared in Dwayne's hand the next day. After that, it blurred together. Every couple of weeks, sometimes 3, the truck would arrive. Dale would ask him to stay late. Pallets would disappear into the freezer. Cash would change hands. Dwayne stopped counting, stopped imagining what was under the plastic. What mattered was the electricity stayed on. Kyle's prescriptions got filled on time. The fridge held real food instead of dented cans from the discount rack. But sleep got harder. Not nightmares, nothing dramatic. Just a constant sense that he hadn't fully woken up. Like part of him was still locked in that freezer, breathing cold air, listening to something beneath plastic shift in the dark. Like the cold never fully left him. It followed him from waking into sleep and back again. He'd jolt awake at 3 in the morning, heart hammering for no clear reason. Some nights he stood in the kitchen, drinking water straight from the tap, staring at nothing. Other nights he opened the drawer, looked at the bracelet without touching it, then closed it again, like it might notice if he lingered. Kyle picked up on it, asked him one evening if he was using again. Dwayne said no, and it was the truth. He'd been clean 18 months, long enough to know the difference between craving and dread. Kyle watched him for a second longer, then let it go. By late January, Dale's office door stayed closed more than usual. One afternoon it opened, and a man Dwayne had never seen stepped out. Mid-50s, tailored suit, the kind of face that had aged out of its good looks rather than lost them. The man gave Dwayne a brief nod as he passed, polite, professional, and somehow deeply unsettling. Dale called Dwayne into the office. He talked about growth, said the arrangement was working better than expected. Other locations wanted in, more trucks, more space. They needed coordination now, Someone to manage schedules, track freezer capacity, smooth things over when complications arose. The last guy had quit 2 weeks earlier, got nervous, asked too many questions, walked away. Dale needed someone steady, someone he trusted. The pay would triple. $1,500 a month on top of his wages. Cash. Dale would remain in charge. Dwayne would just be the hub, the one who knew where things went when they arrived, who to call if something went wrong. Dale laid it out plainly. Other grocery stores, a distribution center, a meat processing plant that no longer processed meat. Some locations owned outright, others leased through shell companies. Electricity hidden inside broader commercial usage, or quietly paid for by people who benefited. Property owners chasing tax write-offs, managers supplementing their income, professionals who understood the value of not seeing too much. Dwayne asked what kind of problems he'd be expected to handle. Dale leaned back in his chair. He mentioned a family that changed their minds after 3 weeks. A coroner who noticed discrepancies in crematorium records. A driver who drank too much one night and decided he deserved more money. Every situation had been handled, quietly, but it required people who could adapt, people who understood that the entire structure depended on staying invisible. "You think you can do that?" Dale asked. $1,500 a month was more money than Dwayne had ever made. Enough to move out. Enough for heat that worked. Enough to fix the Buick instead of praying it survived winter. Enough to stop living one missed shift away from sleeping in the car. It was also enough to mean there was no pretending anymore. This wouldn't be helping out. This would make him part of it, responsible for it. Dwayne thought about the bracelet, the date etched into metal, the freezer door closing with a sound that still echoed in his chest. And he realized the question wasn't whether he could do it. It was whether he still had the option not to. About the families who signed papers they didn't fully understand. About the bracelet hidden in his kitchen drawer. About the quiet truth that he'd become another link in a chain that fed on desperation. "I can do it," Dwayne said. Dale smiled. It was the first time in 6 months Dwayne had seen him do that. Dale told him a phone would arrive the following week, prepaid, no names, numbers already saved. When it rang, he answered. When something needed handling, he handled it. The phone showed up on Tuesday. A cheap flip phone, 3 contacts, one labeled D2 more M and R, meant nothing to him. He kept it powered off in his locker unless he was on the clock. It rang for the first time on Friday night. The call came from M, a woman's voice, flat and efficient. Delivery scheduled for Sunday morning, 4:30, different site. Behind the old Kmart 2 towns over. Solo job. He'd need bolt cutters. The loading dock was chained. Sunday morning, the parking lot was a dead sea of asphalt and abandoned shopping carts. The truck idled near the dock, engine low and patient. Dwayne cut the chain, the snap of metal echoing louder than it should have. The driver passed him the freezer key without a word. He was halfway through the second pallet when headlights washed over the dock. Dwayne locked in place. A police cruiser rolled slowly into the lot, spotlight drifting across empty storefronts and darkened windows. Dwayne stood motionless behind the pallet, one hand frozen around the dolly handle. The light slid across scattered carts, paused. Then it centered on the loading dock. He saw the officer's silhouette shift inside the car, arm lifting toward the radio. At that exact moment, the truck's refrigeration unit kicked on with a long, mechanical wheeze. The spotlight moved. The The cruiser rolled away, turning toward the far end of the strip mall. Dwayne didn't breathe for 2 full minutes. The cold from the pallet seeped through his gloves, into his palms, grounding him in the moment. When he was sure the cruiser wasn't circling back, he finished unloading. The driver handed him an envelope, $600 in clean bills, told him to make it look like vandalism. Dwayne scattered the broken chain links and kicked one down a storm drain. His hands shook the entire drive home. Dawn crept over the horizon, and he checked his mirrors for flashing lights that never came. The bracelet felt heavier in the drawer when he got back. Kyle was awake making coffee, asked where he'd been. Dwayne said inventory work. Kyle nodded and let it rest. After that, the calls came faster. Different towns, different drivers, a distribution hub in Mansfield, a shuttered meat plant outside Columbus, a storage facility in Chillicothe. Each job paid between $500 and $1,000. Each one pulled him deeper. He began to recognize the vehicles before they arrived. The primer gray Toyota, a rusted white panel van, an old Ford F-250 riding on Dayton tires, humming like it knew the way. With time, he started noticing details he hadn't before. Faded company decals on truck doors, patterns in license plates, the same vehicles turning up in different towns. He started recognizing people too. A thin man who always wore a Cleveland Browns jacket, even indoors. A woman in her 60s with careful makeup and hands that shook no matter how warm it was. They kept their conversations short, never used names, never said anything that couldn't be taken back. Once in Columbus, while unloading with the man in the Browns jacket, Dwayne heard him laugh while staring at one of the pallets. The plastic was cinched tighter than usual. "Yeah," the man said softly, the sound sharp and humorless. "This one had it coming." The driver didn't respond, just kept working. Dwayne wanted to ask what that meant. Wanted to know if every pallet came from a desperate family trying to avoid paperwork and grief, or if some of them were something else entirely. People who'd crossed the wrong line, caused the wrong kind of trouble. But he didn't ask. He kept pushing the dolly, because knowing wouldn't change what his hands were doing. February slid into March. The work never slowed. His bank balance climbed. He moved into a one-bedroom apartment with clean carpet and a shower that actually worked. He brought the bracelet with him and hid it in the same kind of drawer, like a ritual he couldn't break. Kyle stayed behind in the old place, said he liked it there. Dwayne suspected Kyle knew something was off, that the money didn't match the job, but Kyle never said it out loud. Dwayne bought a newer car, a 2008 Accord with miles to spare, clothes that hadn't been worn by strangers, meals eaten sitting down, in places with menus and soft lighting. It should have felt like progress. Instead, it felt like proof. In mid-March, the phone rang with the R number. A younger man spoke, his accent unfamiliar. There was an issue with one of the Piggly Wiggly pallets. The family had changed their minds. Different arrangement now. They decided on burial, proper channels. The body needed to be prepared, cleaned up, presentable. Dwayne asked which pallet. The answer landed hard. The one from December, the plastics planned. The hand. He was told to meet someone at a funeral home in Newark at midnight. Bring the pallet. Use the service entrance. No questions. Drop it and leave. That night, Dwayne loaded the pallet himself. The driver was the same one from the beginning. The man who'd once sat motionless in the dark behind the store. He spoke for the first time as they secured the load, asking how long Dwayne had been doing this. Long enough, Dwayne said. The driver nodded, said it got easier, said the trick was stopping yourself from thinking about what was under the plastic and starting to think about the money instead. That's how you lasted. They drove through the night toward Newark. The funeral home waited for them at the edge of town. A converted Victorian house, tall and narrow, its windows dark, its shape standing out against the street like it was holding its breath. At the end of a dead-end street, Richard was waiting by the service entrance. He looked close to 70, thin as a wire frame, wearing a pressed suit despite the hour. He spoke softly, politely, as if they were early guests instead of what they were. He guided them into a preparation room and told them where to place the pallet, right beside the embalming table. When it was done, he thanked them with a formality that felt rehearsed and slipped an envelope into Dwayne's hand. Then they left. Back in the truck, the driver broke the silence, asked if any of this bothered him, not the work itself, but the idea that they were smoothing over someone's death, making it clean enough to accept. Dwayne said he tried not to think about it. The driver nodded, said that was probably the smartest way. He'd been doing this for 4 years. At first it ate at him. Then his daughter got sick, cancer. Hospital bills piled up until everything else, ethics, guilt, hesitation, felt abstract. This job paid. The math became simple. Dwayne asked if his daughter was okay now. The driver kept his eyes on the road and said she died 18 months earlier. He said he kept working anyway. By then, it was all he knew how to do. They drove the rest of the way back, without another word. Dwayne thought about the bracelet, about the hand he'd seen months ago, about whether the two belonged to the same person. He wondered if he should have returned it, placed it back where it came from. But the bracelet was already in his apartment, and the body was already with Richard. The next morning, the phone rang again. There was a problem. One of the handlers had been pulled over, bolt cutters in the trunk, a freezer key on his ring. No charges yet, but the police were asking questions. Too many questions. They needed to shut down several sites immediately and relocate the inventory. She sent a list of addresses. He had 72 hours. For 3 days straight, Dwayne moved pallets. Some were familiar, others weren't, which meant the network stretched further than he'd ever been told. He worked 18-hour shifts. His hands blistered, his shoulders burned. The smell soaked into everything, his clothes, his hair, his skin. A blend of freezer burn, formaldehyde, and bleach that clung like fog. He showered twice a day and still couldn't escape it. The silence of the freezers followed him everywhere. The clack of rubber wheels echoed inside his head even when he lay down. By Friday night, he'd moved 37 pallets. He knew the number because he counted. Not the way he used to, tracking schedules out of curiosity, but deliberately, methodically. 37 people whose deaths had been inconvenient enough to hide. 37 problems erased. 37 stories sealed in plastic. Families maybe, or maybe not. Maybe some were like the Brown's jacket man had said, people who'd had it coming. On Saturday, the woman called again. The handler was talking. They were done. Everything had to go. Every pallet, every location, no storage, no delay. She gave him an address in Hocking County. A quarry. Deep water, no cameras, no witnesses. She said cinder blocks had already been arranged. Dwayne asked what would happen to the families. The woman said that wasn't his concern. He asked about the handler, The line went dead. The dumping took 2 nights. Dwayne rented a box truck and loaded it himself, pallets first, then the cinder blocks. The drivers were gone. The phones were silent. The network was folding in on itself, people vanishing the way they always had. He drove to the quarry alone. The water was black beneath the moon, smooth and lightless, like an opening cut into the earth. He tied the blocks on with rope and ratchet straps, dragged each pallet to the edge and pushed. One by one, they slipped into the dark. 37 pallets, 37 splashes, 37 rings of ripples that widened, thinned, and vanished. Somewhere among them was the person who'd worn the bracelet, the one with the tiny book charm, the one who'd been young in 2009, someone who'd read things, saved things, lived long enough to choose what they loved, someone who'd been a person before becoming a problem. Dwayne watched them disappear into the water. He finished just before dawn on Monday, returned the empty truck, drove home as the sky began to lighten. The phone was ringing when he walked through the door. Dale told him not to come in. The store was under investigation. He needed to get rid of the phone, destroy anything that tied him to deliveries. There was no paper trail, no records, no proof. Keep quiet, Dale said, and this would fade. Dwayne asked about the families, the ones who paid, the ones whose dead now lay at the bottom of a quarry instead of in the ground. Dale was silent for a moment. Then he said they'd made their choice. They knew the risks. That was the cost of doing business outside the system. Sometimes business failed. Sometimes you lost what you paid for. That was just how it worked. Dwayne ended the call. He took the phone apart, snapped the SIM card, and dropped the pieces into 3 different dumpsters. Then he went home, lay on his bed, and stared at the ceiling. He thought about the hand he'd seen that first night, the bracelet that had slipped free, the way he'd covered it with his foot and taken it home like proof of something he didn't have words for. He wondered if that pallet had ever reached the funeral home, if the family had been allowed to bury what they were promised, or if it too rested in the quarry, swallowed by dark water. The investigation lasted 3 months. Dwayne watched the news, watched them discover the freezers, watched them question Dale, who denied any knowledge of unauthorized storage, watched them arrest the cooperating handler, a quiet man with a limp Dwayne remembered seeing twice. Looked like in daylight. The news had broken and 2 detectives came to the store. They pulled Dwayne into the break room, along with every other night shift worker. Questions came fast. Had he ever seen anything unusual? Noticed Dale doing anything strange with the back freezer? Ever been asked to help with deliveries outside normal hours? Dwayne told them the truth. He stocked shelves, mopped floors, broke down cardboard, never went in the back freezer. Dale kept it locked. He had the only combination. Nothing unusual ever crossed his path. The detective scribbled notes, asked if he was sure. He said he was. They moved on to the next employee. Dwayne waited for them to chase the financial trail, the single suspicious payment from December, waited for the handler to give up names, but no one came back. The handler didn't know him, had only met him once, couldn't even recall what he looked like. Just knew Dale had a guy who sometimes helped with pickups. The case revolved around Dale, but without bodies, without proof beyond empty freezers, without a paper trail, they couldn't pin anything down. Dale lawyered up, stonewalled, and eventually, the investigation went cold. Dwayne's name never appeared anywhere. He was clean officially. He kept working nights, stocking shelves, mopping floors, breaking down cardboard. The rhythm of the store became his world again. Dale retired 2 months later. The new manager was younger, sharp, indifferent to the past. New freezers went in. The old damaged goods freezer became seasonal storage. Kyle asked him once if he was okay. Dwayne said he was. Kyle said he seemed different. Dwayne said people change. Kyle dropped it. The money sat untouched in his account. He didn't know what to do with it. Money was neutral. It was the choices it enabled that carried meaning. And Dwayne couldn't find any choice that could make the past 6 months mean anything other than what they were. The bracelet stayed in its drawer. Sometimes late at night, he opened it, looked at the tiny book charm, tried to decipher the engraving. The date was clear, 2009. The rest was worn smooth, impossible to read. He wondered what book it represented, wondered if the person who wore it had died holding it. In early July, the store needed day shift coverage. The regular guy called in sick. The new manager asked Dwayne to work 9 to 5 for the week. He said, okay. He'd been on nights so long, he'd almost forgotten what the store looked like in daylight. Looked like during business hours. He'd forgotten what it was like to see the town moving through the aisles, to hear chatter and carts rolling, to see people shopping under fluorescent lights instead of the quiet hum of an empty store at night. On Thursday afternoon, he was restocking the frozen food section when he noticed her. A woman standing in front of the ice cream, maybe 40, wearing a coat far too heavy for July. She wasn't making a sound. She was just standing there, tears rolling down her face, staring at the Ben and Jerry. Dwayne froze. He recognized her not from the store, not just from town, but from growing up here, Maple Street. He remembered her daughter a few years behind him in school. Quiet girl, always with a book. Charlotte Henderson. He'd heard about the accident. Everyone in town had. January. Charlotte's car had gone off Route 83 during an ice storm. They said she died instantly. Quick, painless, but the funeral had been delayed for weeks because of complications. Nobody talked about what kind of complications. In a town this small, you learn not to ask questions when things didn't add up. His mouth went dry. He asked if she was okay. She looked at him, red eyes, said she was fine, just having a hard day. Then she laughed a little, the kind of laugh people make when the absurdity of their own grief hits them. She said Charlotte had loved Cherry Garcia. They'd eaten it together straight from the container. She came every Thursday to buy some now. Said it was the only thing that made her feel close to her daughter. Dwayne murmured that he was sorry for her loss. She thanked him, said it had been 6 months. People kept telling her it would get easier. It hadn't. Charlotte had been 23. They said it was quick, no pain. But there had been problems releasing the body, something about an investigation. By the time she was allowed the funeral, nearly a month had passed. Closed casket. The funeral home insisted. Too much damage from the accident. She picked up a container of Cherry Garcia and held it like a talisman. Then she said something that made Dwayne's chest tight. Charlotte used to wear a little bracelet, a gift from her grandmother when she was 13. A book charm because she'd always loved to read. They'd buried her without it. The police said it must have been lost in the accident, thrown from the car. Mrs. Henderson had driven that stretch of Route 83 a dozen times, searching ditches for it. Never found it. She wished she knew where it was, wished she had it now. Dwayne felt the floor tilt beneath him. The world spun just slightly, enough to take his breath. The bracelet in his drawer, the little book charm, cold metal warmed by his pocket. 2009, Charlotte's age, Charlotte's gift. He could feel every memory, The frozen pallets, the cinder blocks, the dark water of the quarry, the hum of freezers pressing into him at once. He wanted to sink to his knees, wanted to tell her, to explain. But no words would reach across the months, across the choices, across what he had done. All he could do was stand there, watching her push the container of Cherry Garcia into her cart and let the grief fill the aisle. Fluorescent light suddenly too bright, harsh enough to make his eyes sting. The cold from the freezer section seeped into his bones, the same way it had on those first impossible nights. He told her he hoped she found it. She nodded, murmured thanks, and started to walk away. Then she turned back. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. She said the funeral home had been strange. Richard, the director, had insisted on handling everything himself. She hadn't been allowed to see Charlotte, not even once, though she'd begged. She'd always wondered if something had gone wrong, if Charlotte had suffered more than they'd told her, if something had been hidden. Dwayne couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. He just stood there, frozen, while Mrs. Henderson pushed her cart down the aisle, clutching her Cherry Garcia, carrying her incomplete grief with her. He finished his shift on autopilot, clocked out, sat in his car in the parking lot for 20 minutes before he could make himself drive home. The bracelet was exactly where he'd left it. He took it out, held it under the kitchen light. The engraving, the tiny letters he'd never been able to read, suddenly made sense. He'd memorized their shapes over months of staring at it in silence. It wasn't a book title. It was a name. Charlotte. He sat at the kitchen table until the sun went down, the bracelet resting in his palm. His mind replayed every fragment. Mrs. Henderson buying ice cream every Thursday. Charlotte, who had loved reading, and Cherry Garcia, who had worn this silver chain until the day her car went off Route 83, or maybe the day before, or weeks before. Dwayne had seen the hand in December, but Charlotte hadn't died until January. He thought about Richard in the funeral home, making bodies presentable, shaping lies to look believable, charging families for the privilege of a burial. Thought about the plastics plant in Zanesville, the line worker caught in the extruder, the story Dale had told him. Thought about the Browns jacket man saying, "This one had it coming." He thought about all the ways a person could become a problem that needed solving. Was it really coincidence that Mrs. Henderson shopped at the same store where her daughter's body had been stored? In a town of 8,000 with one grocery store, where everyone knew everyone, where he had grown up 2 streets away from where he worked, and Mrs. Henderson had lived on Maple Street her whole life. Of course she shopped here. Of course she walked these aisles. Of course their paths would cross eventually. Or maybe it wasn't coincidence at all. Coincidence at all. Maybe guilt had its own gravity, a silent force pulling the evidence of your deeds into orbit, whether you wanted it there or not. Maybe this was just the inevitable consequence of helping people disappear in your own town, of taking advantage of neighbors' desperation for survival. Maybe it was what happened when you pocketed the last piece of someone's daughter, the last tangible memory, and hid it in a drawer. The bracelet had warmed to his body, but still felt impossibly cold, like a frozen shard of memory lodged in his palm. He could return it, wait until next Thursday, find Mrs. Henderson in the store, hand it to her, explain that he'd found it, invent some harmless story about where it had been. But to do that would open doors he couldn't close again. Questions would follow, explanations, unraveling every decision, every night spent pushing pallets through freezing cold storage, every choice that had pulled him deeper into complicity. Or he could keep it. Let it rest in the drawer, bear the weight quietly, privately, letting it seep into the contours of his life until it became just another part of who he was. He thought about what he had become, not a grocery store worker, not someone scraping by to pay the bills, but the man who had helped make 37 people vanish. The man who had moved Charlotte Henderson's body like a damaged shipment, frozen and wrapped, through freezers and storage spaces that smelled of ammonia and death. The man who had watched her mother cry silently in the ice cream aisle and said nothing. The man who had taken the final piece of Charlotte that her mother would have clung to and tucked it away, because acknowledging it would have been inconvenient, messy, impossible. He thought about the families, some who had just needed time, space, a way to navigate systems that were slow, cruel, bureaucratic. Others, he now realized, probably weren't families at all, just people whose problems needed erasing, who'd made deals to make certain lives vanish quietly. He thought about the handler who had cooperated, who had quietly followed instructions without question. About Dale, who had said, matter-of-factly, that this was just the way the world worked. About the woman who had called to coordinate the dump. About the driver who kept working through it all because this had become all he knew. He thought about Kyle, who had called the ambulance 18 months ago when Dwayne's heart had skipped and almost failed, who had never asked where the extra money had come from, because asking would have forced both of them to acknowledge the truth they already understood. The bracelet felt impossibly heavy, heavier than it had any right to be. It carried all of it: the pallets, the freezers, the cash, the nights of silence, the smell of freezer burn and chemicals. His apartment, his hands, the empty drawers, they felt like the only tangible reality he had touched in 6 months, the only things that anchored him to a world where normal life still existed. Dwayne opened the drawer carefully, laid the bracelet inside, and closed it with a deliberate press, as if locking away a fragment of his own conscience. The next week, he returned to night shift, telling the new manager he preferred those hours. The manager didn't care. Day shift was covered by someone else. Mrs. Henderson continued to come into the store on Thursdays. He knew because he checked the schedule, because he made sure he was never on days when she shopped, made sure their paths would never intersect again. It was easier that way. Easier to pretend he didn't know. Easier to move through empty aisles, stocking shelves in the dark, breathing in the chill of the freezers without remembering the faces behind the plastic wrap, without hearing the unspoken cries that still echoed in his mind. The bracelet stayed in the drawer. Dwayne never touched it again. He never thought to move it or dispose of it, never imagined explaining it to anyone. It became just another silent weight in his life, a piece of a history he couldn't undo, a token of choices that had changed him forever. He walked through the aisles of the Piggly Wiggly night after night, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, the faint chill in the air, the distant memories pressing at the corners of his mind, carrying the quiet knowledge that some things once done could never truly be put back together. Someone could be reduced to a ledger entry, a palette, a problem to solve. He thought about the families, about the ones who had paid, the ones who hadn't, about the ones who'd never known what had happened to their loved ones. About Charlotte, about the others, about the quiet nights stacking frozen bodies, the cold seeping into his bones, the metallic tang in his nostrils, the rhythm of dollies over concrete that had become a pulse he could never forget. He realized that the weight wasn't in the bracelet or even in the memory of what he'd done. It was in knowing that choices had consequences, that some actions left permanent traces in the soul, invisible to the world but impossible to ignore for the one who had done them. He could never undo it. He could never return the lives, the moments, the chances that had been erased. He could only carry the memory, carry the bracelet, carry the understanding that some guilt doesn't vanish, that it settles into the quiet corners of a life lived afterward. Dwayne placed the bracelet back in the drawer slowly, deliberately, as if tucking away a shard of history, a fragment of someone else's existence that had become part of his own. The kitchen was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, the only reminder that life went on outside the weight he bore. He thought about Kyle, about how he'd left, how he'd moved on, oblivious to what had unfolded in their shared apartment. He thought about the Piggly Wiggly, the new manager, the fresh freezers, the aisles now filled with shoppers who would never know what had transpired behind the scenes. He thought about the network gone now, the trucks, the handlers, the cinder blocks in the quarry, the ripples on the water that had disappeared long ago. About Dale, about Richard, about the countless decisions made by people who had normalized this work, who had justified it in terms of efficiency, necessity, survival. About the moral calculus that had begun with a $200 cash envelope and ended with him standing in his kitchen, holding the last piece of Charlotte's childhood, realizing he had been part of something irredeemable. He knew he would carry it always, the bracelet, the memory, the weight of knowledge. He could live a normal life in the eyes of others, work nights, pay bills, sleep in an apartment with functioning heat. But he knew he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And in some quiet way, the bracelet was both a reminder and a punishment, a physical manifestation of the gravity of choices made under desperation. Dwayne sat there long after the light had faded from the kitchen window. Outside, the world moved on cars passing, neighbors walking dogs, life continuing in its careless rhythm. But he stayed, holding the bracelet, feeling the cold echo of the freezer nights, the unshakable presence of people reduced to cargo, and the terrible clarity that some things once known and done could never truly leave you. Eventually, he set it down, closed the drawer, and left the kitchen. The bracelet waited, and so did the memory, patient, unyielding, forever a part of him, a silent testament to what he had witnessed, what he had done, and what he would never speak of again. It started with a quiet thought, barely a whisper in Dwayne's mind. In a town of 8,000, someone could vanish without a trace. Not because people didn't care, but because the systems built to protect them were tangled and slow, full of gaps and blind spots. And he'd learned how to navigate those gaps. He'd learned how to survive, how to take advantage of the cracks nobody else noticed. At first it was small, just helping out after hours, moving pallets that no one asked about. A $200 cash payment slipped into his hand like a secret. No questions, no receipts, just trust and shadows. Then another job, and another. Step by step, load by load, Dwayne realized the truth of what he was doing. Every pallet concealed someone's worst day, someone who was gone and wouldn't come back. And yet the money made sense. It kept the lights on, kept his brother fed, kept life from collapsing entirely. Until one night, 6 months in, he saw it. A small silver bracelet tangled in the wrapping with a tiny book charm. It belonged to a girl he'd known in school, Charlotte Henderson. He walked past her house countless times. She lived just 2 streets away. The realization hit him like ice in his chest. This wasn't just about work or survival. He had become part of something larger, something unrecognizable. Someone who moved lives like cargo, who kept a girl's memory in his pocket without permission, without understanding, and yet with total responsibility. He tucked the bracelet away in a drawer, along with batteries, spare keys, and forgotten matchbooks, as if hiding it could contain the weight of it. Outside, the streetlights painted the counters with the same shadows they had every night, a steady rhythm in a life that had become unsteady. The cold seeped in from November's air, settling into the corners of the apartment, curling around him the way the memories curled inside his mind. The world kept moving, Mrs. Henderson continued her ritual, buying Cherry Garcia every Thursday, standing in the frozen food aisle with silent tears. Dwayne walked past her, silent, invisible, carrying the secret of what had really happened to Charlotte. The quarry held the rest. 37 names, 37 lives erased, 37 stories reduced to cold ripples and cinder blocks in black water. And still, life outside continued, unbroken, unknown. Dwayne returned to the night shift like a man, walking a loop he couldn't escape. He stocked shelves, mopped floors, folded cardboard, feeling the numbness creep into his hands the way it had from the first nights in the freezer. He counted nothing anymore, kept no tally. The work was endless, anonymous, necessary. Survival had become routine, morality a distant echo. And yet in the quiet hours, when the store hummed softly behind him and the night pressed against the windows, he thought. He thought about Charlotte, about the bracelet resting in the drawer, about all the choices that had led here, about the ways people became problems and the ways people became solutions or excuses, about how easy it was to disappear, to let a town of 8,000 forget, while he carried the weight alone. Outside, the cold settled deeper into November, steady and unrelenting. Inside, Dwayne Cutler stood at the window, hands empty now, eyes tracing the shadows on the counter, feeling the silence of a life reshaped by secrets. The bracelet stayed in the drawer. The body stayed at the bottom of the quarry. Cherry Garcia kept being bought every Thursday. And Dwayne kept working the night shift, stocking, mopping, folding, moving through the rhythm of unchanging tasks, carrying everything that no one else could see, everything that could never be erased. Story 2, The Four Who Stood Too Close. The town had a way of holding its secrets in plain sight. Dr. Matt's new office sat in what had once been the harbor master's home, though the harbor itself was little more than a narrow curve of shingle that vanished beneath the tide's silvery sweep. The air smelled of salt, old paint, and the faint must of disuse. The windows didn't quite fit their frames, rattling with even the gentlest gust, and through them the cliff stretched endlessly, a jagged silhouette against a restless sea. The council had arrived in person, 3 men in threadbare elegance, offering a sum of money that made questions unnecessary. 3 patients, they said, handled discreetly. Tourism was fragile here. Some things had to disappear quietly. For a man like Dr. Matt, whose London practice had been bleeding, whose house echoed with empty rooms since his wife had left, and whose own mind had begun to mirror the mechanical despair of his patients, the offer was irresistible. A chance to be needed again, to feel usefulness that still mattered. The journey down should have taken 4 hours. It took 6. How or why, he could not say. The town itself was smaller than he expected, a main street lined with shuttered shops whose windows showed only hollow interiors, as if the buildings themselves waited for something that would never come. Even the petrol station attendants seemed to recognize him, though they had never met. It began on his second evening while reviewing the council's files. 3 patients, 3 attempts, all at the same cliff visible from his window, all within 6 weeks. All survivors, though by what miracle remained unclear. The medical reports were thin, pages evidently removed, but the intake photographs unsettled him more than anything else. Dr. Matt had seen thousands of faces in his career, learned to read them. He could tell the forced smiles, the posture that whispered shame, the neutrality masking compliance. But these 3, Miss Asheville, Mr. Garrett, Miss Hollowell, stared with a quiet, waiting patience that refused interpretation. No fear, no relief, no fractured absence, only calm. They seemed certain that something promised would arrive and arrive in time. He closed the files and poured a glass from the Scotch decanter already open, left perhaps by the last occupant of the building. Raising the glass, he caught his reflection in the window, superimposed against the cliff. For a heartbeat, he could not tell which was real, the man or the landscape beyond. Then the wind swept through the rattling panes, and the sound was not just wind. It carried the weight of something unseen, a rhythm that whispered he was not alone in noticing the cliff's pattern, the exact locations, the inevitability that pulled these lives to the edge. Dr. Matt took a sip, feeling the scotch burn as the tide's reflection trembled in the glass. Outside, the cliff waited. Inside, he understood, some things were patient, some things were inevitable, and in that understanding he felt both dread and strange anticipation. The wind rattled the window panes, shaking loose the fragile sense of control Dr. Matt had tried to hold onto. The cliff outside seemed sharper now, darker, almost watching. Tomorrow, the sessions would begin. He'd scheduled them back to back, yet a creeping unease told him the decision might not have been entirely his own. The appointments were neatly written in his calendar, in handwriting that mirrored his own, but something about the loops and angles felt off, as though someone else had traced them while he wasn't looking. He poured the last of his scotch and climbed the narrow stairs to the room above the office. Sleep claimed him faster than expected. The unfamiliar surroundings, the salt-sweet air, the ever-present cliff, none of it kept him awake. Instead, he sank into the unconsciousness of someone who had carried too much for too long. And as often happened in restless minds, water filled his dreams. Tidal silver waves, jagged rocks rising like teeth, the scent of wet stone and wind. At precisely 9 o'clock, she arrived. Miss Gillian Ashfield was guided by a young woman who introduced herself as her sister, though the resemblance was faint enough to make Dr. Matt pause. Pale hair where dark should have been, narrow features where broadness belonged. Only the hands matched, long and delicate, moving with the precision of a lifetime spent in careful work. The sister departed silently, her footsteps lingering unnaturally long in the stairwell, echoing like a shadow of sound. Dr. Matt turned to the patient. Miss Ashfield was blind, the file said, but the file did not prepare him for the way she seemed to navigate the room with unerring attention, cataloging every object before moving on. Her sightless eyes found him immediately, settling with an unshakable focus that made his chest tight. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, almost laughing at his own reflex, but she moved directly to it anyway, as if guided by some inner compass, folding her hands neatly in her lap. Her coat, old-fashioned with a fur collar, rested on her knees like a carefully arranged sculpture, each fold exact. He began with the usual opening, asking how she had found him, whether the journey had been difficult. She replied matter-of-factly, her sister had driven her. 20 minutes. Familiar roads, familiar rhythms. Dr. Matt noted the precision, the attention to detail. The file listed 15 miles. 20 minutes suggested cautious driving, deliberate movement. He made a mental note. Here was a patient who existed in a world where ordinary measures, distance, sight, expectation, were reshaped by her own exacting perception. The room felt smaller yet heavier. The air carried salt and paint, the faint chill of the cliff wind that seemed always on the verge of entering. Dr. Matt realized with a subtle creeping dread that the sessions ahead would demand more than clinical skill. They would require observation, patience, and a willingness to witness something entirely unfamiliar, a consciousness tuned to a reality he had never truly known, waiting, always waiting for him to catch up. The first words she spoke cut through the quiet room like a knife. "You're bleeding." Dr. Matt froze. He glanced down, almost in disbelief, and then reached toward the left side of his jaw just beneath his ear. A faint smear of red greeted his fingers. He thought it stopped hours ago, checked in the mirror before leaving, but here it was, a whisper of his own body betraying him. And yet the woman across from him sat utterly calm, her posture precise, her voice unshaken. Miss Ashfield, blind, or so every specialist had insisted. 3 separate evaluations, each confirming the same impossible verdict. Optic nerves destroyed, irretrievable, no light, no hope. Dead tissue, nothing but scar. But she had just told him exactly where he was hurt. No hesitation, no searching, just fact, matter-of-factly, as though the tiny wound were as ordinary as the weather. Dr. Matt blinked, a shiver crawling up his spine. He had treated patients for decades, cataloged every nuance of expression, every micro-movement, every hesitation in speech, but nothing had prepared him for this. She leaned back slightly, tilting her head as though his surprise amused her. "I paint," she said softly. "Or perhaps I still do. The method has changed, but the essence remains." Her words carried a weight he didn't immediately grasp. Painting, she explained, had become her lifeline after the fall. 47 canvases in 106 days, each one born in marathon sessions that stretched her body and mind to their limits. 16 hours for the first. She had worked without pause, without thought for food or rest, until collapse claimed her. When she awoke, she had no memory of the creation itself. Her sister, patient and meticulous, had photographed the work while she slept. Dr. Matt watched as she retrieved the photograph from a worn leather portfolio at her feet. With an effortless grace, she slid it across the desk. It landed precisely in front of him, centered, a silent assertion of control over a world she could not see. He lifted the image. The canvas spanned nearly 5 feet in his mind's eye. A shipwreck, eerie and hypnotic, sprawled across a seabed of shifting white sand and jagged black rock. Hulls split like gaping mouths, timbers encrusted with barnacles rendered with exacting care. Every frond of kelp seemed to obey unseen currents, bending and swaying as if alive. He could almost hear the soft hiss of water, the gentle scrape of sand against hull. "What, how?" he whispered, the words tasting of awe and disbelief. Her lips curved faintly. "I remember everything, not as imagination but as recollection. Every brush stroke, every choice of color, every detail of what once was. The memory lives in the movement of my hands, not in my eyes." She paused, letting him absorb it. "The fall didn't take the vision I need, just the one you expect." Dr. Matt felt the room tilt. The Sultan paint scent, the faint whistle of wind through the imperfect window frames, the rattle of the old building, they all seemed to fade behind the intensity of what he was witnessing. A mind sculpting reality without sight, a body moving with exactitude where others would stumble, a brilliance that defied logic. And then a subtle shift. Her hand hovered briefly above the photograph, tracing lines she could not see, affirming shapes she could only feel. Dr. Matt understood then that the miracle was not simply in her ability to paint, but in the world she had reconstructed entirely within herself, a world that could survive, even flourish, without light. The wind outside tore at the cliffs, a reminder of chaos beyond the window. Inside, time seemed to slow. Every detail, every movement of her fingers, every precise motion became a revelation. Here was a mind unbroken, a vision untouched by tragedy, reshaping perception itself. And Dr. Matt realized he was no longer the observer. He had become part of the scene, a witness to a world that refused to bend to expectation. A world where darkness could still create beauty with terrifying precision. The moment Dr. Matt lifted the next photograph, a chill ran through him. The canvas unfolded a world beneath the waves, a realm Miss Ashfield could not possibly have seen. Fluid currents twisted and bent with uncanny precision. Light diffused in ghostly green ribbons, illuminating wrecks and ruins in ways that defied natural expectation. And in the broken windows of a sunken captain's cabin, dozens of faces stared outward. Men, women, children, their mouths frozen between cries, prayers, or the last gasp before the water claimed them. But their eyes held no fear. Matt leaned closer, heart hammering, and realized they were focused, intent, concentrated on something lost to them, something they were desperate to hold on to even as the sea dragged them down. This is impossible, Matt murmured, his hand hovering over the photo. The accuracy, the perspective, it's flawless. You couldn't learn this from books, not blind. Miss Ashfield slid another image forward, then another, each one more startling than the last. A meadow of seagrass dotted with children's shoes, tiny Mary Jane's, polished school boots, the smallest hiking shoes, arranged as though they had sunk hand in hand. A Victorian iron staircase plunged into unfathomable darkness, its rails tangled with strands of hair or kelp, the distinction lost in the painterly haze. A drawing room perfectly intact at impossible depths, tea service arranged with exacting care. A woman's hand reached for a cup, swollen and distorted by long immersion. She spoke softly, her voice calm as water. I was never a maritime painter. I painted landscapes, rolling hills, country hotels, commissioned views of leisure. Nothing meant to last, nothing meant to survive me. There was no bitterness, only observation. I was adequate, competent, invisible. That was fine, until the fall. October 14th, just after dawn. She remembered fragments, though not fully. The cliff path slick with overnight rain, the sharp tang of wet earth and salt in the air. Why she had walked that morning she could not say. Her sister suggested routine. Yet the memory of the path itself, the way the wind sliced over the rocks, the precarious dance of stones underfoot, was etched in her mind as clearly as if her eyes had recorded it. Dr. Matt's fingers trembled over the photograph. The technical mastery, the impossible precision, the visceral storytelling of each brushstroke. It was a language no blind painter should have known. Yet here it was, undeniable, a testament to a mind that transcended its limits. The ocean's secrets were revealed not through sight, but through touch, memory, and something deeper, something the world had yet to understand. And Matt realized with a sinking awe that he was witnessing the rebirth of an artist who had drowned in loss and returned with vision sharper than any eye could provide. A creator whose work would haunt, unsettle, and redefine what it meant to see. Could feel the waves battering against the hull, smell the brine and fear, hear the timbers groaning like they were alive. Every detail imprinted itself in her mind as if she were there, not imagining, not reconstructing, but inhabiting the moment. Her hands moved on their own, sweeping, dabbing, pressing pigment into a truth that no eye could see. When she paused, exhaustion threatening to collapse her, she realized she had been painting not with sight, but with memory, with presence, with something that transcended her blindness entirely. The canvas before her revealed the meridian in violent clarity. The jagged rocks, the angry sea, the crew scrambling, the passengers frozen in terror and disbelief. Each figure was placed with intention. Each angle, each shadow was calculated with a precision that rivaled any technical manual. She'd seen the currents, the eddies, the way light refracted through water at different depths, though she had never studied such things. Her body remembered the rhythm of the waves, and through that memory, she rendered what had been invisible to every map, every report. She painted from Isaac Vane's perspective, the boy who had clung to the railings, whose wide eyes had seen the world end in a single, unforgiving hour. She felt his hunger for survival, his fear, his desperation. She could sense the weight of the storm pressing down, the way wood snapped, the way water swallowed everything. And she painted it all, not as fiction, not as a second-hand account, but as a lived, internalized reality she carried in her mind. When she finally stepped back, her hands trembling, the room silent except for the faint hum of the heater, Dr. Matt could see it as if it were breathing. He leaned forward, stunned. The ocean, the wreck, the lives suspended between panic and inevitability, all laid bare by a woman who had no eyes yet saw everything. There was no doubt. She had been somewhere beyond consciousness, somewhere no human mind should reach, and she had returned bearing evidence. Evidence in color, in texture, in unimaginable precision. This is extraordinary, Matt whispered, the air thick between them. Miss Ashfield only nodded, her fingers brushing the edge of the canvas. She did not need to see his reaction. She did not need validation. The storm, the wreck, the boy, the crew, the passengers, they were all accounted for now. And through her, the past spoke, revealing what the charts had missed, what the sea had hidden, and what memory alone could illuminate. It was no longer simply a painting. It was a portal, a testimony, a reckoning. And Dr. Matt realized, with a shiver that ran from the nape of his neck to the tips of his fingers, that he was not merely observing art. He was witnessing a mind that had touched the impossible and returned to tell the story. The moment the story began, it pulled you under like cold water, sharp, unrelenting, impossible to ignore. She knew things no record could ever hold. Names, places, fragments of lives long buried beneath waves, yet somehow still alive in her mind. She knew he had come from Portsmouth, the blacksmith's cruel hands shaping the boy into someone desperate for escape. She knew the prayers he never spoke aloud as icy water filled his lungs, prayers textured with hope that even death might spare him what life had denied. She could feel the chill of it, the unnatural cold that stole his breath before he even realized it, and that brief, weightless moment where his spirit hovered above the body, wondering at its own sudden freedom before being dragged down into the silent depths. And the shoes, so many shoes, tiny, abandoned, suspended in an underwater meadow. They belonged to 36 children lost in a ferry disaster off Cardiff in 1902, their innocent outing to see cliffside seabirds ending in tragedy. She painted it as if she were the matron, Mrs. Dorothy Walsh, who had clutched their hands, forcing them into a chain, a final act of protection that persisted even in the water's crushing embrace. She captured the upward drift of hair like living kelp, the small faces pressed together, and the unthinkable consciousness of Mrs. Walsh, lingering far longer than any human should, witnessing the impossible. Relief had been her final thought. At least they were together, unalone in the dark. Every painting she created drew from a different set of eyes, a different final witness. Death had no need for eyelids in the ocean. It held them open, a silent observer of what had been, what was lost. She became the vessel for that vision. Through her brush, the cook's mate from the Meridian, the Victorian gentleman weighed down by debts, the mother whose grief had turned deadly, the fisherman trapped by rocks, the lovers who'd chosen death as a pact, all of them spoke through her. She saw their moments, their fears, their last breaths, and they in turn saw through her. Dr. Matt had scribbled notes for hours, but he finally put down the pen, mesmerized. "How do you understand this?" he asked, voice caught between awe and disbelief. Was it learned, gradual, a careful study over time? She tilted her head, a shadow of a smile brushing her lips. "No," she said. "The moment I woke in that hospital, I knew. Not in pieces, not in thought, it was instant. It was as if the world had shifted and I simply saw." And Matt realized in that tense, silent studio that she had crossed into a territory no human mind should reach. She had become a conduit for the unrecorded, the lost, the drowned. Her fingers, guided by memory and presence alone, recreated entire worlds beneath the waves. Every ripple of water, every fragment of wreckage, every suspended soul was hers to witness, hers to bear, hers to render with impossible fidelity. And as he stared, heart hammering, he understood. She wasn't just painting. She was giving voice to the silence, sight to the blind, and a reckoning to the depths themselves. This was no art. This was the ocean speaking, filtered through a mind that had touched the impossible and returned. And in that truth, every viewer, every observer would feel the cold press of water and the heavy weight of lives remembered. The understanding hadn't arrived as words or explanations. It settled into her the way the body knows things before the mind catches up, like waking and sensing without checking the clock, whether the night had been restful or fractured. It was simply there, complete, undeniable. The voices she'd spoken with while unconscious weren't symptoms or hallucinations. They were introductions. Each drowned soul had taken a turn, borrowing her breath, using her mouth to say a name, a memory, a presence. By the time her eyes opened in the hospital bed, the connections were already woven tight. She wasn't hearing them anymore. She was part of them. She described it as a network, vast, layered, ancient. Something that stretched backward through centuries of storms, ferries, miscalculations, quiet despair. She was no longer an individual observer. She was a point of convergence. They don't want punishment, she said calmly. They don't want peace. They don't even want forgiveness. What they wanted was far simpler and far heavier. They wanted to be seen. Most drownings happened without witnesses. A slip, a wave, a moment too late. Bodies vanished beneath the surface, and the exact second when breath ended went unmarked. No one recorded the final thought, the last fear, the small private hope whispered into the water. The sea kept those moments for itself. She was taking them back. Every canvas was a testimony. Every brushstroke was evidence that someone had been there, had existed, had crossed that threshold. She would keep painting until every death along that stretch of coast had been acknowledged. She had completed 47. According to the drowned themselves, according to what they showed her, there were roughly 863 remaining. The number should have sounded impossible. It should have sparked questions about time, endurance, sanity. Instead, Dr. Matt found his thoughts drifting somewhere colder. He began calculating years, output, lifespan. The figures refused to cooperate. Even at her current pace, she wouldn't finish in one ordinary human life. Unless something changed. Unless she lasted longer than she was supposed to. He asked about the fall. What had she been doing on the cliff that morning? Her expression shifted, not sharply, not with fear, but with something closer to discomfort. A fleeting hesitation crossed her face, the kind that came when truth carried an awkward shape. I was called, she said. Not recently, not suddenly, for years. The drowned had been reaching for her long before the fall, but she'd been busy painting agreeable hills and harmless skis. Scenes meant to decorate hotel walls, not disturb anyone's dinner. She hadn't heard them, not because they were quiet, but because her life had trained her to ignore anything inconvenient. The fall hadn't been an accident in the way people like to define accidents. It had been necessary. Dr. Matt asked the question he was obligated to ask. Had she jumped? Her fingers tightened together in her lap, knuckles whitening just slightly. The distinction mattered. One answer demanded intervention. The other suggested something no training had prepared him for. "I don't remember deciding," she said slowly, "but I remember not resisting." She remembered the wind tearing past her, remembered the strange calm as the ground rushed up, or rather, as the sky fell away, and she remembered relief, not fear, relief. As if, in letting go, she had finally stopped disappointing something that had been waiting very patiently for her to listen. She had felt it then, finally, a presence that made the life she'd been avoiding impossible to ignore. A weight of attention, patient, insistent, but not cruel. The room held the quiet that follows revelation, broken only by the hypnotic pull of the waves tapping against the shingle, a rhythm deliberate enough to feel like a heartbeat. Miss Ashfield gathered the photographs with flawless precision, sliding each back into her portfolio as though handling relics centuries old. Not a single frame tilted, not a single corner bent. She rose, smoothed the crease in her skirt, and moved toward the door with the absolute certainty of someone navigating worlds invisible to the rest of humanity. Her hand rested on the doorknob. "They're watching you," she said softly, voice carrying just enough weight to unsettle. "They've been watching since you arrived. They recognize you, Dr. Matt. They are patient, very patient, longer than you could measure." Her footsteps descended the stairs, calm, measured. Dr. Matt went to the window, squinting at the pale light. Miss Ashfield stepped onto the beach, paused, and tilted her head, not toward him, but toward the cliffs, the jagged edge beyond where the land met the unknown. She remained still, listening to instructions audible only to her, before striding down the shingle with unwavering confidence, her path certain though no map could chart it. Dr. Matt sat back at his desk, pen hovering over the intake form. "Visual impairment following fall," he wrote under presenting problem. "Compulsive artistic production," he added under patient stated concerns. Each phrase rang hollow. Neither captured the essence of what had just occurred. The revelation that a blind woman could paint with the eyes of the drowned, that she had been called to the cliff by voices only she could perceive. Writing such a thing risked labeling her delusional. Yet he could not, would not, dismiss the evidence. The paintings themselves were breathtaking, alive with impossible detail. The second file lay open before him. Mr. David Garrett, 53, widower. The photograph showed a man whose skin carried the pallor of one recently returned from illness, eyes red-rimmed, perpetually damp, as if the world had never stopped grieving him. He had jumped 17 days after Miss Ashfield's fall. Unlike her descent, attributed to accident, his was deliberate. At the cliff's edge, he had left his shoes perfectly aligned, his wallet neatly placed beside them. Each act of preparation spoke of intention, a final message coded in the ritual of departure. Dr. Matt leaned closer to the file, heart pounding. The waves outside matched the rhythm of his thoughts, relentless, insistent. Somewhere between tragedy and purpose, between life and the pull of the sea, he realized that the stories weren't finished. They were just beginning. The room smelled faintly of salt, old paint, and the sharp tang of ink. Dr. Matt exhaled slowly, fingers brushing the edge of the photograph, tracing the damp eyes of a man who had chosen to step into the water. And for the first time that day, he understood that he was witnessing not just grief, not just loss, but a network, a chain of calls and responses that stretched across the living and the drowned, all converging on a blind woman who could see more than anyone had ever imagined. The wallet lay open on the desk, a photograph of his late wife tucked neatly inside. The shoes were still aligned beside it when rescue crews arrived. Yet somehow, Mr. Garrett himself had drifted ashore half a mile down the coast, alive, though hypothermic beyond what should have been survivable. Dr. Matt glanced at his watch. 11:00 a.m. precisely. The appointment had been scheduled for 11, but the knock came at 10:58. When Dr. Matt opened the door, Mr. Garrett stood in the hallway, water dripping from a coat that should have been dry for days. The man's lips carried a pale blue tinge, and when Dr. Matt extended his hand, the handshake felt like grasping something preserved in ice for centuries. "I'm sorry," Mr. Garrett said almost immediately. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly. For the water dripping onto the floor, for his damp fingers, for the puddle forming beneath the chair he eventually chose, for the tremor in his teeth that no warmth could soothe. Despite the room being comfortably heated, the cold seemed embedded in him, a frost that no thermometer could detect. Every instrument registered normal, yet he carried an internal winter that refused to thaw. He declined tea, explaining flatly that heat no longer held comfort. "I've tried," he said. "Everything hot tastes like room temperature. Everything cold tastes colder." His perception of warmth and chill had shifted, or perhaps stretched into dimensions Dr. Matt could not measure. Dr. Matt inquired about Grace, Mr. Garrett's wife. The file told a simple story. Drowned alone in a swim 4 years prior, recovered 2 days later, identified by her wedding ring and a birthmark on her shoulder. The funeral had been proper, the guest book filled with names he could no longer recall. At first, grief had been manageable, he explained. He had sorted her belongings, donated clothes to charity, removed photographs from public spaces while keeping one on his bedside table. He returned to work as an insurance assessor, politely declining social invitations until he could endure them. He had designed a life that functioned without her presence, a routine that almost felt tolerable. The house they had shared was sold, the memories within it too loud, too numerous. He had purchased a modern flat in town, stripped of most furnishings, leaving only a few pieces. A lamp she had loved, a bookshelf acquired during a shared holiday. These fragments were the only anchors to a past that otherwise refused to exist. As Mr. Garrett spoke, his gaze drifted to the photograph on the desk. The water on his coat continued to drip in slow, deliberate drops, each one a reminder that some things, pain, loss, survival, never fully dry. And though he was physically present, Dr. Matt could feel the invisible weight of everything the man had carried. A coldness that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with memory, absence, and the sea. For almost 3 years, he held the shape of a life together with small, careful weights, just enough memory to stay anchored, not enough to drown. A lamp she loved, a shelf they bought on a trip that still smelled faintly of train stations and rain. He told himself this balance meant healing. He told himself endurance counted as recovery. And for a while it worked. He began to picture a future that wasn't just survival disguised as routine. Travel brochures left unopened on the kitchen table. A cheap watercolor set purchased on impulse, still wrapped because she once said he'd be good at it. The idea of sharing a meal with someone new, nothing dramatic, nothing permanent, just a voice across the table, a witness. Then came the day that broke the illusion. It was their 20th anniversary. He took the morning off, dressed carefully, chose flowers that wouldn't look like an apology. The plan was simple: stand at the grave, say what needed saying, leave. A ritual, controlled, respectable. But standing there, reading her name carved into stone, something shifted. The thought arrived fully formed, without effort or emotion. Not despair, not panic, certainty. He wasn't supposed to be the one still breathing. Not as punishment, not as failure, as error. like a number that had carried wrong in a calculation long ago and finally revealed itself. The idea didn't feel new. It felt remembered, as if he'd always known and only now stopped pretending otherwise. From that day on, the road changed him. He didn't decide to drive past the cliff. He simply did, again and again. A longer route home, 20 minutes added without explanation. He would park in the gravel turnout meant for tourists and sit in the car while daylight thinned and tides rehearsed their patience. He watched the water rise and retreat, watched the cliff hold its line against the sky. Sometimes he stayed until darkness erased depth and distance alike. On the last day, he didn't sit in the car. He parked, walked, stepped forward. No pause, no bargaining. The act felt old, like finishing a sentence started years earlier when the sea took her first. He didn't leave a note. Notes explain. This didn't need explanation. The fall is clear in his memory, sharper than most of what came before or after. The air warming as he dropped, strangely gentle, as if welcoming him closer. Time loosening its grip. The water below unfolding into detail, ripples, reflections, a precise point of entry he understood with absolute confidence. Then impact became something else. Not collision, arrival. Cold seized him instantly, but not the kind he knew. This wasn't winter. It was the temperature of places untouched by warmth. The cold between stars. The cold that exists where heat has never been invited. And in that cold, he understood why he hadn't died. Because something had noticed him. Something patient. Something that had been waiting at the edge for a very long time. Warmth but active negation of it. Cold as something present, tangible, almost sentient. Yet he did not die. He sank deeper and deeper into water that should have crushed him, yet instead unfolded like a corridor of rooms, each one strange, alive, breathing. His lungs drew in a substance that wasn't air but served as air, and he opened his eyes to the impossible. Time stretched. Moments lengthened. The doctors later claimed it had been 3 minutes. He felt like hours. And then he saw her, or something that wore her face. Grace waited on the seabed, or something echoing her, her white summer dress fanning in slow-motion currents, dotted with blue flowers. Her hair moved like liquid silk, floating around her head. Her eyes, clouded with the milky veil of long immersion, were unblinking and patient. She did not speak. She could not. Her mouth had been claimed by the water too long, but her hands beckoned him closer. He followed, down into the cold, into the impossible suspension between life and death. There she showed him memories, yes, but not his memories. They were hers. Moments he had lived with her, now reframed, reshaped, seen through the lens of her presence. Their courtship, their wedding day, their 15 years together, familiar yet alien, a narrative rewritten in someone else's eyes. And in her perspective, he saw himself clearly, painfully. His gentleness, once a source of pride, became a mask, a subtle performance layered over unacknowledged needs. His careful acts of love, once invisible, now read as small assertions of control, quiet edicts he'd imposed unknowingly. The home they shared, the friends he selected, the invitations he allowed, everything framed as practicality or protection. But under her gaze, it was the architecture of diminishment. The night with her sister, Grace had wanted to intervene, to help. He had spoken rationally, advising against it, citing her sister's dramatics and dependency. Grace had consented. The calls had stopped. The relationship had faded. All of it, as he now saw it, had been rewritten by his choices, the subtleties of control hidden beneath the surface of love. The water around him seemed to pulse with understanding, with the quiet judgment of someone who had endured, who had seen, who had waited. And in that cold, in that strange immersion, Mr. Garrett understood that the life he thought he had led had always been half observed, half interpreted, and now laid bare in a way no one living could ever witness. He remembered it differently now, seeing it through Grace's eyes, and everything shifted. The jealousy he dismissed as trivial, the irritation at her laughter with her sister, the quiet manipulations he'd never admitted to himself, all suddenly revealed themselves as deliberate, invisible lines he'd drawn around her life. Even the bathroom door, the argument he could no longer recall, became terrifying in a new light. She had locked herself in to cry alone, to have 10 minutes of privacy without him parsing her every expression. He had removed the hinges just to make sure she was okay, he'd said later. But through her perspective, it was a violation, a reminder that her own space was granted at his discretion, not hers. The memories cascaded, unspooling with merciless clarity. The friends she drifted from, the career she abandoned to accommodate his routines, the laughter she forced when his jokes fell flat, the agreement she feigned when his observations were wrong, every act of submission a carefully performed theater of contentment. And then the revelation hit him. Her drowning hadn't been an accident. She had walked into the sea with intention, choosing release over continuation. The room went still. Even the steady, hypnotic rhythm of the waves outside seemed muted, distant, as if another world pressed in around them. "How do you know?" Dr. Matt's voice was soft, careful. Mr. Garrett's hands trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of remembering with precision. "I felt it," he said, his voice low. "At the bottom, in that freezing water, she showed me everything, our life, her perspective. I could feel her last thoughts as if they were my own. Every choice she made, every calculated moment of preparation, telling friends she was visiting family, telling family she needed time alone, walking into the water, stopping, surrendering, sinking. It all became tangible to me." He paused, the room holding its breath. Her final thought, relief. Relief that it was over. Relief that she would never have to perform happiness again, never have to explain herself. Relief that she was finally free. It was almost joy. He swallowed, but there's more, because Grace wasn't dead. The words hung there like a jolt of lightning. 3 days after his rescue, a constable had arrived, unannounced, unexpected, with news that would upend everything he thought he knew. The knock at his door had been quiet, almost apologetic, yet what followed shattered the quiet rhythm of his afternoon. A constable had arrived, asking routine questions about his jump, casually mentioning someone in Edinburgh who might have insight into his state of mind. A woman missing from the area 4 years ago. Grace Garrett, alive, working at a botanical garden under her maiden name. No note, no divorce filings, no goodbye. Just a disappearance executed with the precision of someone orchestrating an escape decades in the making. The body he'd mourned, a stranger. Misidentified, misplaced grief draped over him like a cloak he had worn without question. The funeral had been closed casket at his request, a mourning built on assumption. He had cried for a phantom, loved a shadow, but the sea, relentless and honest, had revealed the truth. Grace hadn't died to punish him. She faked it to save herself from him, from their life, from the suffocating narrative he had unknowingly authored. She had given him the mercy of grief, a last false kindness, until the water stripped it away. He stared at his shaking hands. The cold that coursed through him now was not physical. It wasn't winter air nor icy water. It was the absence of lies that had kept him warm, the removal of the illusion that he had been a better man, a devoted husband, a participant in a happy marriage. For 3 years he had walked through a story that wasn't his. Now he faced the stark, penetrating truth. "What do you want from these sessions?" Dr. Matt asked, cautious. "Nothing," he said after a long pause. "I don't want to fix anything. I came because the court said I had to, so someone signs a paper saying I'm no longer a danger to myself. That's all." But both men knew it was more than paperwork. The danger wasn't in repeating the act of the jump. The danger was in living with the cold, in carrying the clarity of truths he hadn't asked for, in understanding what he had been, unknowingly, blind to. He buttoned his coat slowly, hands trembling from cold, age, or the strain of honesty itself. He left, leaving behind wet footprints that stubbornly traced a path across the floorboards, refusing to evaporate, refusing to acknowledge the rules of physics. Dr. Matt bent to mop the puddle, but the water was impossibly cold, biting through his skin in a way that made him recoil. He left it. Some truths, he realized, could not be erased. Light fell through the office window at a wrong angle, casting shadows that ignored reality. The desk lamp's shadow leaned toward the glass, the chair's shadow stretching where no light source existed. Time itself seemed uncertain. He remembered the morning in fragments. Miss Ashfield's paintings, Mr. Garrett's confession, the pervasive, impossible cold. But the sequence shifted in his mind like cards shuffled by an unseen hand. On his desk lay the third file. Miss Jennifer Hallowell, age 17, schoolgirl. The photograph stared back at him, a new story waiting, one that would pull him deeper into the currents he was only beginning to understand. The moment the door creaked open, Dr. Matt's attention snapped to the girl standing there. Pale as ash, dark hair falling in uneven strands, eyes deeper than the gray afternoon outside. Her face was a mask of careful neutrality, the kind of mask teenagers learn to wear when showing anything real invites questions they can't, or won't, answer. Miss Jennifer Hallowell had jumped 17 days after Mr. Garrett. No note, no warning, no sudden breakdown. Nothing to hint that she might step off the cliff that loomed outside the window like a silent judge. Her parents described her as quiet, diligent, a touch withdrawn, but otherwise ordinary. Schoolwork, excellent. Future plans, university applications in motion. Life looked normal. Too normal, Dr. Matt knew, for a tragedy that would rewrite everything around her. Often, we had no idea meant exactly that. No one wanted to see. He checked his watch. 2:45, appointment at 3:00. His gaze drifted to the cliff visible through the office window, jagged against the fatting sky. He traced the winding path with his eyes, imagining 3 points along its edge where the world had bent for those who'd fallen. Dawn, Miss Ashfield. Dusk, Mr. Garrett. Late afternoon, shadows stretching long and thin, Jennifer. All three had survived what should have been fatal plunges. All three had returned changed. All three spoke of the drowned as though they were still present, still watching, still holding memory in their cold, patient grasp. And all three had looked at him with the same unsettling calm, the same unblinking expectation. At 2:58, soft footsteps crept up the stairs. Unlike Miss Ashfield's steady certainty or Mr. Garrett's heavy deliberation, these were tentative, each step hesitated, a pause in the rhythm as though the climber doubted their own courage. When the knock came, it was almost a whisper. Dr. Matt opened the door to find her. Shoulders drawn inward, arms folded protectively across her chest, eyes glued to the floor. She wouldn't look at him, not once. Jennifer Hallowell entered the room with the careful, self-conscious air of someone who feels every glance pierce her skin. She chose the chair farthest from the window, pressed her back to the wall, and kept her eyes locked on her hands, folded meticulously in her lap, movements precise to the point of strain. Dr. Matt offered tea. A subtle shake of her head declined it. He tried small talk, easy questions, trouble finding the office. Comfortable in the room. How was the weather outside? Minimal answers. A faint tilt of the head here, a tiny exhale there. That was all. Every gesture, every pause carried weight. She was a girl suspended between fear and inevitability, her body taut with the unspoken history that had brought her here. Dr. Matt knew it already. Jennifer wasn't just another patient. She was the latest thread in a pattern he was only beginning to understand. The cliff, the cold water, the survivors who returned bearing secrets from below the surface. And in that room, with the gray light sliding over her hair and the edge of the world visible through the window, the first hints of what she had seen, and what she might reveal, hovered between them like a held breath. She answered in fragments, one-word replies, sounds that barely qualified as speech. Her parents had warned him it would be like this. Since surviving the fall, their daughter had retreated from the world as if it were radioactive. No school, no friends, no sunlight. She lived behind drawn curtains. Every mirror in the house had been buried beneath fabric, every reflective surface turned face down or hidden like contraband. They called it a fear of mirrors because they needed a name. Doctors always do. She had been passed from one office to another. Pills offered, refused. Scans performed, nothing found. A well-meaning specialist had tried to ease her back into reflection slowly, carefully, as though the problem were simply nerves. That session had ended with Jennifer screaming until her voice broke, clawing at her own skin as if something were trapped beneath it and trying to get out. Her parents had restrained her, crying, apologizing, promising never to try again. They had come to Dr. Matt because they were out of places to go, because someone at the council whispered that he listened differently, because when you're desperate enough, rumor feels like hope. Dr. Matt studied the girl in front of him. She looked worn thin, as if sleep and food had become optional inconveniences. Her wrists seemed too small for her sleeves. Her fingers were raw, nails chewed down to pain. Shadows lived permanently beneath her eyes. She carried herself like someone who had been running for a long time and had only stopped because there was nowhere left to flee. Instead of asking questions, he did nothing. He let the quiet stretch. Minutes passed. The clock clicked steadily. Somewhere beyond the walls, the sea kept breathing against the shore. Jennifer's breathing slowly followed suit, easing from sharp, shallow pulls into something steadier. The silence did what it often does. It became unbearable. "I can't look at it," she said at last. The words were barely audible, like they'd scraped their way out of her throat. He didn't rush her. When she didn't continue, he asked gently what she meant. "Anything that shows me back." Her fingers tightened together. Her shoulders rose. He sensed the moment teetering, the thin line between confession and collapse, but she stayed with it. "It isn't me," she whispered. The sentence landed heavily between them. When she finally lifted her eyes, he understood why no one had pushed her further. Her pupils were blown wide, swallowing the color of her irises, dark and reflective in a way that felt wrong, like deep water pretending to be still. She told him about the morning everything broke. It had been an ordinary weekday. She, woken early like always, showered, put on her uniform, stood in front of the mirror she'd owned most of her life, an ornate thing passed down through generations, heavy and cold and trusted. Her mother had once told her it was important for a young woman to see herself clearly. Jennifer had been tying her hair when she noticed the smile. Not hers. It was small at first, fleeting enough to dismiss, a trick of glass, a lapse of attention. She told herself that even as her chest tightened. Then it happened again, slower this time, wider, a smile that didn't belong to the face she felt inside her own skin. Her reflection lifted its hand, beckoned. Jennifer staggered back, hit her chair, heart hammering so hard it felt visible. The figure in the mirror stayed close to the surface, smiling patiently, waiting. Its movements lagged behind hers now, just enough to be noticeable. When she raised her hand, it followed too late. When she stepped left, it moved the wrong way. That's when she ran. She didn't look back. She grabbed her bag, tore through the house, fled into the morning air. Her parents were gone. The house was empty, except it was. She walked without direction, driven by one urgent need: distance, away from the mirror, away from the thing wearing her face, away from the certainty that something had taken her place the moment she noticed it. She reached the cliff without deciding to. It felt safe in a way nothing else did. Final, clean. Below her, the water waited, flat, gray, uninviting. Not storm dark, not alive. The dull gray of old metal. And in that moment, stepping forward felt easier than turning back. She said the last thing she remembered before the water took her was seeing a face where no face should have been. Right before gravity finished its work, she looked down and saw herself staring back from the surface below. Eyes bright, mouth curved in invitation, as if the sea were holding up a mirror just for her. Then the impact came, or something like it. The world collapsed into force and cold. Weight pressed in from every direction. Air vanished. Her body forgot its own instructions. Arms moved without purpose. Legs kicked at nothing. Water forced its way inside her, and with it came a certainty so complete it was almost calm. This was the end. Fighting only made sense if you believed in a future. She didn't. She felt herself loosen. Not pain, separation. As if the part of her that thought and hoped and feared simply slipped free and drifted away. And then noise, hands, light. She woke coughing on stone, voices shouting, someone wrapping her in rough fabric. Strangers leaned over her asking questions she barely understood. They told her she was lucky. The tide had been high. The rocks submerged just enough to break her fall. No real injuries. No water in her lungs. A near impossible outcome. They called it survival. She didn't. Her first night in the hospital, she saw it again. Not in steel or glass, but in the dark window across from her bed. Her reflection hovered there too clearly, too sharply outlined, moving when she didn't. While Jennifer lay still, the figure paced. Its lips moved, shaping words she couldn't hear, but somehow understood. Come back. You're not finished. After 3 days, they sent her home. She covered every mirror immediately, tapping sheets so tightly they bowed inward. Still, she felt watched, as if something stood patiently just beyond the fabric, waiting for the smallest gap. She stopped showering because tile gleamed, stopped going outside because windows remembered her face. Even her phone became dangerous. The dark screen showed her smiling when she felt like screaming. It never threatened her. It invited her. The thing in the glass was endlessly calm, certain in a way that only comes from knowing time is on your side. It understood exhaustion. It understood that running forever wasn't possible. When Dr. Matt asked what she believed would happen if she finally looked, really looked, she didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice sounded distant, like it had traveled a long way to reach him. I think I'd realize I've been wrong, she said. That I'm not the original, that I'm the echo. The reflection is the one who belongs somewhere real. The room seemed to cool at those words. He asked her to explain. She traced slow spirals into her palms as she spoke. Everything since the jump felt fragile to her, like scenery made of paper. The hospital, her parents' relief, the weeks hiding in her room. None of it carried weight. It felt staged, as though she were watching a play designed to distract her from something still happening elsewhere. She believed she was still falling, that the moment of hitting the water had never arrived. That time, stretched thin by terror, had unfolded into days and conversations and rooms like this one. She said the mind could do that, build entire worlds inside a single second if the alternative was extinction. This, she said quietly, might just be another place I made so I don't have to finish drowning. The reflection wasn't cruel. It wasn't hunting her. It was waiting at the bottom, offering rest. Not the shallow ending she kept inventing, but the real one. The kind that doesn't require pretending. She was afraid of stopping, afraid of finding out whether landing meant peace or nothing at all. So she kept falling, kept constructing reasons to believe she'd survived. This office was one more reason. This conversation was one more delay. When Dr. Matt asked for the date she jumped, she answered without hesitation. November 17th, late afternoon. He checked his calendar. By his count, only 6 weeks had passed. Time fractured. 6 months had passed, or maybe only weeks. The calendar made no sense, days sliding and folding over themselves like wet paper. Hours stretched into eternity, then snapped away before he could measure them. His watch read 3:15, though the conversation had felt endless, as though they'd been suspended in that room for hours, maybe longer. Suddenly, Miss Hallowell rose. The chair scraped faintly, a brittle sound in the thick quiet. She hugged herself, turned toward the window behind the heavy curtains, eyes deliberately averted. "I'm not going home," she said, voice steady, certain, like a decree carved into stone. Dr. Matt rose, concern tightening his chest. "Do you need me to call your parents?" he asked, but she shook her head. Her movements were fluid, almost otherworldly, as if she glided rather than walked. "The reflection knows," she murmured, words curling with inevitability. "I'll look eventually. Everyone does. And when I do, I'll see I've been on the wrong side all along, that everything I believed was real was just the dream of drowning." She paused at the threshold, listening to something only she could perceive. Then her gaze flicked back at him for a fleeting heartbeat. Her features rippled, refracted, as though seen through disturbed water. "You already know what I know," she said softly. "You're just better at pretending you don't." And then she was gone, her footsteps fading down the stairs, light almost floating. Dr. Matt moved to the window facing the cliff. He pulled the curtain aside. In the gloom, a lone figure lingered at the edge, motionless, patient, waiting. Impossible to identify, yet unmistakably deliberate. Minutes passed. Nothing moved. Time hung heavy. His watch still read 3:15. He let the curtain fall and returned to his desk. "Acute anxiety, dissociative features," he wrote. "High risk for self-harm." But the words felt empty. Miss Hallowell hadn't come for help. Like the others, Ashfield Garrett, she had come to show him, to demonstrate the truths that lived beyond reflection, to warn him that time, as humans understand it, was a fragile illusion. His eyes drifted to the puddle left behind by Garrett, still spreading, still impossibly cold. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw a face forming on its surface. His own, younger, smiling in a way he hadn't remembered ever doing. He looked away quickly, unsettled. He tried to write notes, but his pen betrayed him. The ink moved, scrawling and vanishing, refusing permanence. Frustrated, he abandoned the attempt and reviewed the files again. Ashfield Garrett Hallowell. 3 jumps, 3 survivals. The location alone should have triggered alarm, patterns noted, investigations launched. Instead, each case was filed in isolation. as if the cliff existed only as a collection of unrelated tragedies, indifferent to repetition or design. Seeking clarity, he opened his desk drawer for a fresh pad. Instead, he found yellowed folders, musty with age, handwriting on the tabs eerily like his own, yet not. The first folder contained a photograph: 4 young adults standing at the cliff's edge. 3 women, 1 man, all in the style of the 1970s, bell-bottoms, flowing hair, casual defiance. On the back, in handwriting unmistakably his, read, "The Drowning Study Group, October 1974." He turned the photograph carefully, faces frozen in anticipation. Young Ashfield radiant and defiant, Garrett brimming with ease, Hallowell older than the others here, her eyes calm, knowing, and then himself. Not a resemblance, not a double, him. Same scar above the left eyebrow, same mouth, same eyes. Late 20s, yet unmistakably the man seated at his own desk decades later. All 4 held hands, linked at the edge, bracing for something he could neither name nor fully understand. Dr. Matt set the photo down as if it might shatter in his hands. Trembling, he opened the next folder. Newspaper clippings from October 1974. The edges were brittle. The headlines faded but whispered the same impossible story, tying these figures to events that defied reason, chronology, and logic itself. A chill settled in the room, not the cold of air, but of comprehension. Something waiting in water, something eternal, and something that had always known he would see. The headlines were blunt, clinical, merciless in their certainty. Mass suicide at Coastal Cliff. 4 members of a spiritualist study group had leapt together during a violent storm, their deaths framed as the inevitable conclusion of obsession and instability. The articles described them as seekers who had gone too far, 4 young intellectuals probing questions better left untouched. The group, according to the reports, had been dedicated to investigating claims of communication with the drowned. They believed consciousness did not end with death by water, but persisted, altered, submerged, enduring. They called it the persistence of consciousness in submerged states. Neighbors described them as intense, withdrawn, polite but distant, earnest, possibly unbalanced. They had rented a small cottage near the cliff for the summer. No visitors, no regular schedule. Days spent conducting experiments, notes, recordings, long silences by the water. Evenings dissolved into discussions that stretched late into the night, circling endlessly around death, identity, and whether awareness could survive the moment the lungs filled. Locals said they always seemed to be waiting for something, though none of them could ever explain what. On October 19th, during a storm violent enough to rattle windows miles inland, all 4 jumped. 3 bodies were recovered days later, broken and waterlogged, identified by personal effects and dental records. The 4th, Dr. Edward Matt, aged 28, psychology lecturer at a London university, was found alive on the cliff, incoherent, shivering, insisting his companions had already jumped, even though their bodies had not yet been found. He was institutionalized briefly, released after 6 weeks, and then vanished from public record entirely. Dr. Matt closed the file. His hands had stopped shaking. The room felt unnaturally still, as though sound itself had withdrawn. Even the sea seemed muted, distant. He understood now, slowly, inexorably. The realization didn't strike all at once. It arrived in waves, each one rearranging the meaning of everything that had come before. The town that had never quite felt real. The patients who spoke of the drowned as though they were still present, still participating. The way time stretched and collapsed, as if it were being assembled moment by moment rather than flowing forward. He had been here before. Not months ago, not years. 50 years ago. He had stood at that same cliff with 3 companions who had uncovered something profound and terrible about water, death, and consciousness. They had formed a pact, 4 minds, 4 bodies, to test their theory with absolute commitment. They would jump together. But at the last moment, standing at the edge with the storm screaming around them and the sea roaring below, he had hesitated. His companions had not. They jumped without him. He remembered the sound, 3 distinct impacts. He had remained swallowed by the cliff in that moment. He remembered running for help, trapped between already shaping the story that would make survival. His companions had gone on a story to whatever waited in the water, and they had been returning ever since. Except he not as ghosts, not as haunted, not really, as participants in a ritual left unfinished. The drowning required 4. 3 could not complete it alone. They needed the 4th. And the 4th had kept refusing. Session after session, cycle after cycle, each time they returned, he pulled them back. The therapy sessions, the meticulous notes, the careful extraction of their stories. It was all machinery, elaborate, professional, humane machinery for keeping them here, for preventing completion. Because completion required his participation. Required him to finally make the choice he had avoided for half a century. The patients were never his to treat. They were his companions, recycling through different bodies, different identities, drawn back by the incompleteness of what they had begun. Miss Ashfield painted the drowned because she had been among them again and again, pulled back before transition could finish. Mr. Garrett felt the cold because he had been submerged across dozens of cycles. Temperature accumulated from interrupted drownings. Miss Hallowell believed she was still falling because Dr. Matt kept her suspended, refusing to let her land. They were patient. They had been patient for 50 years. They returned because the pact remained binding. And he kept scheduling sessions, kept taking notes, kept performing the rituals of professional concern that allowed him to avoid the truth. Dr. Matt opened the 3rd file. His hands were steady now. Inside was a single sheet of paper. 4 names written in his handwriting. Gillian Ashfield, David Garrett, Jennifer Hallowell, Edward Matt. Beneath the names, a date. October 19th, 1974. Beneath the date, a single line. The drowning completes at midnight. He checked his watch. 11:45. When he looked again, 11:51. Time was accelerating, collapsing toward the moment he had postponed for half a lifetime. Dr. Matt stood and went to the window. The cliff was no longer empty. 3 figures stood at its edge. Miss Ashfield, Mr. Garrett, Miss Hallowell. They were not looking at the water. They were looking at him, waiting with the infinite patience of those who had already surrendered to waiting. The watch read 11:58. Dr. Madison put on his coat, the same coat he had worn in October 1974. It showed no sign of age or wear. That should have seemed impossible. It didn't. Nothing seemed impossible anymore. Impossibility was just another room he had constructed to avoid leaving. He descended the stairs, his footsteps echoing through a building that might never have existed. He emerged onto the shingle beach. The 3 figures remained at the cliff's edge. They did not turn as he approached. They had expected him. Every glance, every pause at the cliff's edge had been for him. Dr. Matt walked across the pebbled shingle, each step feather-light as though the world itself had loosened its grip. He reached the cliff, and there they were. Miss Ashfield to his left, Mr. Garrett to his right, Miss Hallowell beyond, waiting, patient, eternal. He joined their circle. Fingers intertwined, four hands locking together exactly as they had half a century ago, rehearsed endlessly in anticipation of this reunion. The sea below was a black mirror, still and unbroken. The wind had vanished. Even the surf had hushed, leaving a silence so profound it felt like the universe itself was holding its breath. Dr. Matt studied them. Miss Ashfield's blind eyes radiated calm certainty. Mr. Garrett's trembling had ceased. Warmth touched his weathered face. Miss Hallowell smiled, not the haunting, mocking curve of her reflection, but a soft, unburdened smile, the one of someone finally at peace. Midnight came and went unnoticed. No bell tolled, no moon shifted in the sky, yet all four knew. The moment had arrived. They stepped forward together. The fall was at once familiar and alien. The air moved like water, the water like air, boundaries blurred. He felt their hands in his, their presence, their relief, the long-deferred completion of something meant to be done decades ago. The impact never struck. It was arrival, convergence, a return to what had always been waiting. Back in the office, everything remained as if untouched by time. Dr. Matt's appointment book sat open, lines of future sessions stretching into years, decades, centuries, files stacked neatly. The Scotch decanter glinted with 2 fingers of amber liquid. Rooms held the deliberate stillness of expectation, as if awaiting the return of their occupant. On the calendar, a single note in his own handwriting: 9:00 a.m. new intake. Special case. 3 patients. Discretion essential. Outside, the cliff was empty. The tide lapped at the rocks with patient repetition, eternal in its rhythm. The beach bore no footprints, no sign of passage. And yet, if one stood at the perfect angle in the perfect light, the edge of the cliff whispered of 4 figures frozen in the instant before the step, hands clasped, eternally poised. Inside the consulting room, the telephone rang. Tomorrow, 9:00 a.m., the first appointment. Dr. Matt would arrive early as always. Files would be reviewed. Questions asked, questions he had asked countless times before. The session would end, notes taken, another schedule, and another. The appointment book stretched into the next century. Every single entry would be kept. Every patient would return, and he would meet them again and again, as he always had, as he always would.